to...
Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending on which part of the world you're in. I would like to welcome you all to another LLF online session hosted by the Lahore Literary Festival. My name is Eman, and I'm delighted to be in conversation with none other than Ms. Susan Abulhawa. She has been a part of the LLF before here in Lahore, as well as some of the foreign editions. Susan is an award-winning Palestinian-American author who is best known for her work Mornings in Jenin and has continued to write other successful novels, including The Blue Between Sky and Water, which was sold in 19 languages before its release, and a collection of poetry entitled My Voice Sought the Wind. Her latest book is Against the Loveless World, which was released in 2020, and which will also be the focal point of our conversation today. Apart from being an author, Susan is also a political activist and is the founder of Playgrounds for Palestine, an NGO that advocates for Palestinian children by building playgrounds in Palestine and UN refugee camps in Lebanon. So welcome, Susan, welcome back to the Lahore Literary Festival. And thank you so much for being a part of our online series.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to be back at this festival. I wish we were there in person, but
I wish
this
is the best we can do for now,
right?
But before we start, I wanted to say that Susan's new book, Against the Loveless World, it's such a special book, and I finished it in 3 days with sleep, and I wasn't bored for a second. And the reason why it's so special is because it's a political book, but not in a and a very educative book, but not in a didactic way. It's more of a humane and philosophical meditation about life and about Palestinians, and I think and it was really very wonderful to read. So thank you so much for writing this, Susan.
Thank you.
So before we begin, and I think people want to hear more from you than from me about what your book is about. So can you tell everyone what Against the Loveless World is all about?
Yeah. So, well, this is the U.S. cover, but I think what you guys have is the UK cover, which is this. So this is the story of one Palestinian woman who starts her life in Kuwait. She was born to Palestinian refugees who made their way to Kuwait, where she was born. And, early on in life, she was a rather shallow young woman with simple dreams of her future. She wanted to meet the perfect man, have, babies and modern appliances that would make her friends jealous. But she very quickly finds herself a jilted wife, and through a series of events, she turns to sex work in Kuwait, which end when after Saddam Hussein invaded and occupied Kuwait, and following the U.S. invasion, the so-called First Gulf War, there was a mass exodus of Palestinians from Kuwait, and Nahr is swept up in that exodus, and she goes to Jordan, and then from there to Palestine. So this is her. It recounts her life, and she tells her story from an Israeli prison cell, and through the course of the narration, we get a glimpse of not only this, the political backdrop that you're talking about, but also the what it means to be refugees, what it means to be perpetual guests in other countries, what it means to be dispossessed of one's home, as a recurrent generational theme that has happened throughout Palestinian history. It's a love story. It is. It touches on a lot of social themes, including family, patriarchy, sex work, revolution, and the like.
Mhm. So before we get into the wider plot, I want to touch a bit more about the genre, so historical fiction, and it's a genre that you mostly write. So in relation to the Iraqi invasion and Palestinians migrating, and in relation to you being a daughter of migration, how did you? I mean, can you tell a bit more about the procedure, the permutations, the challenges of writing historical fiction in this particular novel?
Historic fiction kind of comes naturally to me. I mean, it tends to be the genre that I read the most. Uh, it's the most appealing to me as a reader, and naturally it makes sense as a writer. And having being a child of um, being a political creature in general, and a student of history, um, and a person, an exiled person who has lived her whole life as a guest in other countries, with all the precariousness of that status. Um, it makes sense for me to gravitate toward historic fiction and toward um, lives that are shaped directly and indirectly by political decisions of people, who, people we don't know, and powerful people, who really define the the trajectories of all of our lives as individuals, who belong to this, dispossessed nation.
So it's a story told in terms of the number of years. So it starts in the 60s and it ends in the 21st century. Uh, can you talk a bit more about how your life shaped the narrative and how difficult it was to get everything so accurate in terms of the historical facts, in terms of the characters,
Mhm.
and in terms of your personal experiences as well?
Yeah, so I mean, with all of my books, it's always a mixture of all of those things. I do a great deal of research, um, mostly about, I mean, about all the details that you wouldn't, think about. For example, um, it's really important to me to get the landscape correct. And I want to know, I do research to know, like, what kinds of flowers, what kinds of trees, what kind of bloom, what would the landscape look like at this particular time of year during this era. So that actually took a lot of time, and it's reflected in the book. Like, there's a lot of botanical uh, interludes in there.
A lot of
um,
comparisons as well between the places of migration as well. So Palestine is very Edenic. It's there's lots of fruits, and whereas Kuwait is more concrete, and the cultures are very different also, despite being
yeah.
part of the Arab world.
Well, of course, yeah. See, this idea of, words really can shape how we think, and which, so when people say the Arab world, there's this immediate sense that it's this homogenous region where everybody's the same, which is why I hate that term. I hate the term Middle East too, because again, it denotes this sort of homogenous singular region. It's like saying, Africa. It's an enormous continent with, you know, vastly different cultures and languages and whatnot. But in the imagination, it's homogenous because of the words we use to describe them. And then the same thing with the Arab world. The Arab world is just that we share a common language, which is actually very different from one region to another. The dialects sometimes are not even understood, and the cultures are different, and of course the terrain is different, um, and that's why it's important for Arabs to write Arab stories, because we know this and we understand this, and when Westerners write about us, these are the things that always really, all this stuff always comes out, like this very basic lack of understanding this very simple concept that I'm explaining now. So we are not homogenous, of course, and there's a very different feeling, and when you go from one region to another, the dialects are different, the way we dress is different, the food is different, the weather is different, the landscape is different, the values are different. And so, yes, of course, that's going to be reflected in the novel, and the main character herself, ruminates on these things too, because she was born in Kuwait, and to her, Kuwait was her country. That she loved the country, she loved it, she loved the desert, she loved the ocean, and she kind of goes into this in-between space in Jordan, and so the physical location is very much tied into the narrative as well. It's interwoven, and the contradictions of the land that mirror social contradictions as well.
So I think that brings us to another point, which I think is quite valid, especially for you, because you're a Palestinian, right, by birth, but you're living in America and you're writing stories about Palestine and Palestinians in English. So how do you how do you manage that in terms of the Western gaze and what people say about, how you sort of develop your characters? So, there's always going to be that, that Westerner on the side saying that, yeah, I was right about that. The women are oppressed and the men are terrible, and it's an evil world out there. So how do you manage that aspect of your identity?
You must have listened to a previous interview or something, because so typically when I write, I really have a one-track mind. I don't really think about the readers. I don't think about the publishers or anything else. I really am focused on the characters, on telling their story honestly with authenticity, and that's where my only loyalty lies. And that's true with this book too. However, I did have to consider this Western gaze during while I was writing this book. And it's because it touches a lot on patriarchy and exploitation of women. Not a lot. I mean, it's just one part of the book and early on. And it's a fine line, right? Walking, you want to tell the truth. And on the other hand, it's replete with these Orientalist traps that you can fall into. And I didn't want to do that, of course. And again, like, none of this would even be an issue if I were writing in Arabic. So I had to kind of think about how would I write this if I was writing in Arabic. And there were some parts where I actually wrote them in Arabic and then I wrote them in English. And precisely to push that to push back at this Western gaze. And there's a lot in the book that I think people who are in tune with Orientalist depictions can maybe pick up, where there was a lot of pushback. So none of these characters don't conform to Orientalist views of Arab women by any stretch of the imagination. And likewise for the main male characters. So, but it is a fact, it is a universal fact that sexual exploitation exists, particularly against vulnerable women and vulnerable young women. This is true. This is true throughout the Arabic-speaking world, throughout Muslim countries, throughout Christian countries, throughout every religion experiences these patriarchal manifestations of sexual exploitation.
Right. So there's a lot, like, with historians as well, especially if they're sitting in the UK or in America and they're writing about the history of the Mughals or the Hindus, or so it's considered, they have to be careful about that. And another, so let's focus a bit on the plot now, like the story. So about Nahr, and and what I found particularly interesting was her relationships with everyone, and even what she does for her family. I think that's really commendable, and I think that's really sweet. But then again, it shows what women have to do for their families and for themselves in times of conflict. So can you talk a bit more about Nahr and her relationship with women in particular?
So this is something that's consistent with all my books, actually, the relationships among women. And I don't ever really plan it that way. It just kind of comes out naturally. I am interested in, I mean, I come from a family of women mostly, and I'm very in tune with, all the nuances of the various permutations and the love, the support, the jealousies, the scandals, the animosities, all of these things, the pettiness and the gossip, um, uh, and I enjoy exploring these dimensions, in particular when it comes to people who are pushed to the margins of society, and um, anybody, women in particular, who sort of deviate from this narrow definition of respectability are particularly prone to being marginalized in our society. And I suspect it's the same in Pakistan. And so I'm interested in those lives, who, our entire society is pushed to the margins of humanity. But within our society, we push women to the margins when they don't conform to narrow definitions of respectability. So there's a really interesting friendship and thread in this book that it kind of came out naturally, and I was really delighted the way it unfolded. And it was a lot of fun to write this relationship. And it's not a friendship initially. It's actually a very contentious relationship between Nahr and the woman who pulls her into sex work.
Iraq, which is interesting because the end, the relationship completely.
Wait, you can't tell the end.
Yeah, it's you.
Yeah.
Everyone has to read it.
Yeah, it comes full circle. We can say that for sure.
Susan is stuck. I think she'll be back in a little bit. Oh, are you back?
Yeah.
You
Sorry.
close it a little bit. That's okay.
Yeah, I was saying that the friendship does come full circle. We can say that. But yeah, so I mean, the way that the dynamics unfold between these two women through the course of the story was really interesting for me as a writer to I want to say witness, because in a way I feel like they were writing their own story, and I did feel like a witness, even though, I mean, I know I wrote it, but yeah, they do write themselves in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and okay. Can we talk a bit more about the cube, which I think is a really interesting facet of the narrative? And my interpretation is the title does come from the cube, Against the Loveless World. I mean, it could be completely different, but I think it's because her sort of thought processes, her anxieties and eccentricities really come out in the cube. And maybe that's how the title came about. But what would you say about her life in the cube? And
so, well, first of all, the title comes from a line from an essay by James Baldwin, which Nahr and Bilal read together when she's in Palestine. Bilal is the man that she falls in love with. So it comes from that's totally from another writer, from James Baldwin, whom I whom I, love and respect and admire, both as a writer and a revolutionary.
Mhm.
But so the cube is, structurally, the book is divided into 7 parts, and each part begins with a chapter from the cube. And the cube is the name of her solitary isolation cell, prison cell. It's this kind of innovative
Mhm.
bondage room that's mostly fully automated, and it's 9 square meters, and the significance of this is that she fills this room with imagined and remembered life, and that's where she's narrating from. And each of the chapters are directional. So there's the cube west, the cube east, the cube north, south, up, down. And in each one of these chapters, she's focusing on what is in that direction in her room, in this isolation cell.
Mhm. Okay. Right. So, in terms of writing the book, and a lot of people were more interested in how you wrote the book, considering you were all the way in America, and then could you travel back and forth to Palestine in the sense that did you conduct any interviews to sort of, get a gist of what people's lives are about, or did you do what were your what was the procedure, the process?
So first of all, I lived in Palestine. I think there's this assumption that because I'm in the United States that I was never there, but I lived there when I was a child. I've not been able to go back. I'm banned. I've tried to go back twice, and Israel has, they put me in a isolation cell, and then put me back on a plane. So the last time I was held in Israel for 36 hours in they have this airport prison, and then I was put back on a plane. So I'm not able to return to my homeland and where my family has been for millennia. There's also this misconception that if you don't live there, that you are somehow disconnected from the culture and you really have no right to write about it. And so, being Palestinian isn't tied to existing in that land. Our entire society is either under occupation or exiled. So there are more Palestinians who live outside of Palestine than do. What makes us Palestinian is it's the same thing that makes someone Pakistani. If you travel to go live in outside of Pakistan, you don't cease to be a Pakistani. You don't cease to be who you are, the child of your parents and the person of a particular history and heritage that is rooted in a particular geographic area. And it's the same for Palestinians. I grew up in a Palestinian family. I grew up eating, Palestinian food with, with a Palestinian grandmother, and everything about our lives was Palestinian, even though we were in Kuwait. And also, in Kuwait, there's a huge, Palestinian refugee population. So we kind of formed our own little Palestine in Kuwait, as it were. So now that said, I think, no matter where you live, even if it's in Palestine, I think we have a responsibility as writers to do research and to ensure that what we're writing is historically accurate, at least the parts, that we claim to be historic. So the historic background, the historic events, the historic personalities, those are all researched, and they're already, well known to me as well. So there are a couple of parts too that there are other aspects that require that have sort of that require an ethical duty to to approach. Number one is the depiction of sex work, and the other one is the depiction of political prisoners. Now, with the sex work, I know what I'm talking about. I have spoken with a lot of people. I have seen it up close. With the political prisoners, I have never been a political prisoner, and that part was really important to me to research and to get as right as possible, which is the reason why I chose this fully fictional room, right? Because I didn't feel that I could responsibly depict an actual prison, having never visited one inside or been in. I've visited prisoners before, but I've never been inside as a prisoner, and I have to rely on the testimonies and interviews that I made with political prisoners, which I did. But even with that, I think it's still a really heavy responsibility, and so I didn't feel I had a right to even try to depict an actual prison, and that's why I created a fully fictional depiction of a something that, as far as I know, does not exist. A fully automated prison cell within Israel called the Cube is not something that actually exists, as far as I know. The psychology of that is something that I ruminated on a lot in my imagination. I spoke, like I said, I spoke with people who had lived through that, and I watched interviews with former political prisoners who had been in prison for 40, 30, 40 years. In particular, some of the Black Panthers who were released, members of the Move family in the United States, things that Palestinian political prisoners had written about, Khalid Jarrar, Ahmed Sadat, and personalities like that. So yeah, those are the two things that I really kind of agonized on to try and get right. Getting Palestinian culture right is not something I really need to research. It's something I was born into, something that I understand viscerally. But I did, yeah, like I said, I mean, just kind of getting the flora and the seasons and things like that right was the subject of my research.
I think that's what everyone needs to sort of work on as well, because not everyone knows about the plants and what kind of plants and etc. what they look like. But I think you did it really good. That was one of my favorite parts, reading the flora and the fauna and what the trees look like and the fruits, and that was interesting, I thought. Um, so we have a few questions from the audience, and someone has asked, Susan, you've lived in several places in the course of your life. Ideally, which place in this world would you call your true home?
It's absolutely Palestine.
Alice?
Yeah, but at the same time, I don't. This is kind of a condition of exile, in that you never really have a home. I don't. I mean, I've been in this particular house for 20 some years. I've been in the United States since I was 13 years old. But there have been many times in the course of my life here where this country reminds us that we are guests. Even though this whole country is a colonial enterprise, the United States has never really felt like home. I have a kinship. I have a deep kinship with Kuwait. I love it. It's, even though it's a desert and not a lot of things grow there, but I find great beauty and solace in sort of open desert terrain. And also, just especially like an open desert terrain that is in such close proximity to the expanse of the ocean, which is quite beautiful. But um, Palestine is the place where all of us began. I mean, everything about me is traced to Palestine. Um, I come from this fabled, ancient society and place, where I have family stories and ancient um, ancient social stories.
Mm.
Uh, and it's also the direction of purpose. It's the direction of struggle. It's the direction of longing. It's a direction of my dreams. And it's the direction of everything that has been taken from me and from us. So um, I don't know if I'll get there in my lifetime. But it's something that I will always fight for. I will always fight to recover that because it's precious and it's too important to walk away from.
Thanks for that. And someone uh, else has asked, Susan, what is your opinion of the recent Arab-Israeli alliance and nexus? If you want to answer that, if you don't want to answer that, it's fine.
Well, I've been very outspoken about what I think about it. I mean, you can find my comments on social media. I think it's I mean, I think they're traitors. I really do. I think anybody who normalizes with an apartheid regime is immoral, frankly, and anyone who conducts any kind of um, business or dealings with them is immoral. I think the United States is immoral for normalizing with Israel. Europe is immoral for doing that. India is immoral for doing that. Israel is a pariah state that is predicated on the dispossession of an indigenous people who have been there for millennia and verifiably have been there for millennia. Like, we were never in Europe, we were never exiled, we had been there continuously, and all because this Zionist movement believes that there are people who are more human than we are and who deserve to have an extra country. So we should all live in exile and live in misery and refugee camps and insecurity, so that every Jewish person everywhere in the world can have an extra country and can have free access to resources that are legally, historically, morally, and socially the purview of the indigenous population that had always been there, and those are the Palestinians.
Okay, thanks for that. There's one last question. How do you perceive the US as a place of exile? If so, why did you choose the USA? Why not someplace else?
Yeah, so the United States is a complicated country, and there's, in my mind, there's more than one United States, right? There's the United States that is a colonial power, that's an imperial power, that's a source of great unrest and death and misery all over the world. And then there's the United States of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and James Baldwin, and there's the United States of struggle, of innovation and massive leftist movements, and um, so it's not it's a complicated country, uh, and a lot of good exists simultaneous with horrendous horrendous impulses. And I didn't choose to come here. It was kind of chosen for me. I was here when I was 13 years old. I didn't really have a choice in the matter. And then I didn't have a choice of anywhere else to go. I mean, I don't have any other place that I can go. Um, I became a citizen here when I was 18, and um, and it's the only place where I am legally allowed to live. Uh, and as a U.S. citizen, I also feel a moral responsibility to actively engage in Indigenous American struggles, in Black American struggles. I mean, these things come to me. These things come to me naturally as a Palestinian, but I also feel a duty to be a part of that and uh, to be a part of it as an active member, someone who writes about it, who goes in the streets, who shows up in solidarity when we're asked to show up in solidarity.
And
So
someone
that's
who
what it means to me to be an American. Yeah,
also just believes in human rights, right?
absolutely,
Because
absolutely.
and and how does your political work inform your writing as well? Does it have a say in what you write?
Um, I don't. When I sit down to write, I don't magically disconnect from who I am as a person. So I think that, and I think that's probably true, for most writers. Um, and it isn't so much. It's not just human rights, but animal rights, and climate, environmental responsibility. All of these things are tied together. y- you know, working alongside various class struggles, anti-capitalist struggles. All of these they're not separate. And in the same way, I am not a separate person as a writer or as an activist, or in the same way that I cannot separate the woman from the mother in me. I don't. There's no separation um, between uh, who I am as a person and the kinds of things that I write. Um, they very much kind of complete each other. That said, um, when I'm writing, I'm not focused really on politics, though. It's always there. This extraordinary personal and collective multi-generational trauma that exists in me as a Palestinian is there. But I'm focused on creating art. I'm focused on prose. I'm focused on the characters. I'm focused. I have a different focus when I'm writing.
Right. Okay. So we just have one last question. How is the book Mornings in Janine connected with this book? What are the similarities or what are the differences?
I mean, I think each book is a separate is separate in its own right. They're not. It's kind of they're in a way. Like I spend on each book. I spend several years writing them. And it's almost like raising a child. They're siblings, but they're all individuals, and they all have their own paths. And I feel that way about my books. Um, I wrote each one of them at a different age and a different time in my life, and so they come out differently, and maybe they reflect, I hope, greater maturity, both as a person but also as a writer. I do feel that with this book, I think I became a better writer than I was with Mornings in Janine. Um, so they're all different, but they're also similar in that they all touch on Palestinians and different aspects of Palestinian life. But then again, like I think that's true of every author. Like people never, like if a white author is just writing about white people, nobody ever says, "Oh, that's a similarity." You're writing about white people. But those of us I mean, white people are the default, and the rest of us are just kind of we kind of, these observations become apparent to most people for whatever reasons. But the other similarities are that, that the protagonists tend to be women. I think I understand women better than I do men. Sometimes I think I don't understand men at all. um, and they're all historic fiction. And again, I touched on that earlier. That's the genre that I gravitate to naturally.
And I think that's a really good note to end on. Thank you so much, Susan, for coming here and
Thank you.
being a part of our online series. I hope you're writing more
Thank you, Emma.
stories, short stories. I'll read them. I'll be the first person to read them. I told you I'm a great admirer of your work.
Thank you.
And thank you so much once again for being here, and hopefully see you soon in the future. COVID-free world.
Inshallah. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks everybody for being here. And thank you for having me again. And inshallah, next time it'll be in Lahore.
Thanks, Susan.
Bye.
Bye.